All right. We might have people roll in a little bit later, but that's okay. This is being recorded. Once it's done processing after we finish the training, we will upload it to our YouTube page. You are welcome to share it with whoever you would like. The more the merrier. So we would really appreciate that. So anybody who can't make it right now for the live training can definitely access it later on. So you're here for the Vernal Pool Inventory Training. My name's Hannah Zinner. I'm the program manager here at Patapsco Heritage Greenway. You may have attended our Vernal Pool webinar hosted by Dr. Mark Sutherland in the spring. And it was a wonderful opportunity for all of our followers to learn more about vernal pools and why they're important. And it really sparked our organization's interest in vernal pools. There's plenty in our area. They kind of sometimes blend into the background and we don't exactly know they're there. So we took a real interest in having this pilot year of inventorying the pools. So the first step to protecting them and to making sure they are there for the long run and they're protecting the species inside is knowing where they are. So that's why you are here, because we are a small nonprofit. We only have a handful of staff on board. So we can't be everywhere at once as much as we wish we could be. So you helping us and going out into the field on your own time and just keeping your eyes peeled for vernal pools is going to be super helpful in helping us know where they are. So let's get rolling. There is a chat section and there is a Q&A section. You're welcome to put stuff in there throughout the presentation. I'll make sure at the end to go over any urgent questions, and then I'm always happy to answer follow-up ones via my email later on as well. All right, so first things first is the outline for the upcoming presentation. What are we going to be talking about? We are going to talk about what vernal pools are again. I do want to start from scratch just so we make sure all our volunteers are on the same page when it comes to understanding what they are and what they look like. We are going to discuss why they're important both for humans as well as for the ecosystem, because there's definitely some bonuses on each side. So we want to make sure we understand why they're important. And of course, we're going to go over how you can help us inventory them. We have a couple of different steps going on there. So I'll just go through the process of what exactly we're going to be asking you to do when you go out in the field. And then we're going to end with safety, both for ourselves as the volunteers and for the vernal pools and the species found inside of them. So there's safety tips on both sides of that. So we want to make sure that we're being safe as possible when we go out into the field and making sure that we don't spread diseases and whatnot. And then finally, just to wrap it up, we'll talk about the future and what we want to see going on in future years. Because, like I said, this is a pilot program. It is the first year of just collecting the basics of where the pools are. There's definitely plenty of things we can do in the future when it comes to vernal pools. So what are vernal pools? This is just your textbook definition. They are dynamic habitats with cycles of standing water and periodic dry downs that exclude permanent populations of predatory fish. You can see that I've highlighted two of the really important words in that definition, both cycles and permanent, and we'll talk a little bit more about those when we move to the next slide. You can see two examples of vernal pools on the right-hand side of that slide of the pictures. One's obviously in an open field, open canopy, and then one is within a forest. So I'll go a little bit into more detail, but you'll definitely know that in this area, it's a woodland area. If you're from Baltimore, Howard County, anywhere in Maryland, in the Mid-Atlantic, you kind of have an understanding that this is a woodland region. So that's more often where you will find the vernal pools in our area. All right, so we're going to go into a bit more detail about the different characteristics of a vernal pool, just so we're on the same page. They are isolated from permanent surface waters. So you might see them as depressions or former stream channels or woodland hollows or maybe created from human excavations. This kind of comes about for a few different reasons, but one of the main ones is because of geological processes. So in the northern areas of the United States, just think about glaciation and how that created those depressions in the land as the glaciers moved away and went over a long period of time. Sometimes we're going to have local erosion, right? Especially in an area like this where we're so used to large quantities of stormwater and whatnot. You're constantly going to have varying levels of erosion in different corners of the watershed, and this can definitely create some vernal pools. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the migration of stream channels. So if you think about a winding river, a winding stream, maybe we have a big storm, a really big influx of water velocity, and it cuts through instead, and it leaves that, that horseshoe bend piece that no longer, has the stream running through it. The power of the river, the power of the stream really made it take a different direction, and that leaves that bend in the river that doesn't connect to the stream anymore. So that eventually over time could become its own vernal pool because it's isolated from that permanent surface water. And then human excavations is really what you think it is. So areas like a farm pond, ditches, when we clear cut, quarries, etc. So it's things that humans do, that we have the manpower to create certain areas that are, man-made. And, vernal pools have soils that are more organic, so they have longer wet periods and less decomposition. So moving on, they are small in size and shallow in depth. And you really want to think about this in comparison to lakes and other wetlands that we already might be familiar with, right? So most of us know what a wetland is. We see it. They're pretty big. But a vernal pool is kind of unique from a wetland because it is going to be a lot smaller and a lot shallower. So it can be really anywhere from, a meter squared up to a few acres. But really in this area, you'll probably only find them in much smaller size, like definitely less than an acre. I read somewhere that the average in the mid-Atlantic region is about 0.1 acres or around 350-ish feet squared, with the smallest ones leaning more towards less than even 100 feet squared. So I'm familiar with one that's right off of the Owella Trolley Trail. And, of course, it kind of depends on the time of year and how much rain there's been, but it's fairly small. It's not going to be more than a couple hundred feet squared. And the depth can also range somewhat, but it will typically be around a maximum of a foot or two deep. So nothing crazy. Something that you could easily, put a yardstick in or stick you find on the ground, and you're still going to have your hand above the water. Let's see. So these small sizes and shallow depth vernal pools are mixed by the wind, which allows the oxygen to get all in there, because it's not just a normal puddle where nothing's growing inside, right? There's going to be good reasons that a vernal pool provides habitat for species. So you need that oxygen, you need that sunlight. They do warm rapidly, which is really important when it comes to amphibian development. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a couple slides. But just keep that in mind because that is an important characteristic, and that is because that they are small and shallow. There is going to be a periodic drying hydrology. It's kind of something that I mentioned earlier on in the textbook definition. And typically, you're going to see a vernal pool being wet a minimum of 2 months. And this is really important. You're going to find that they're deepest in late winter, early spring, but they could potentially fill again in the fall. And the frequency of their drying hydrology can really vary from year to year. Maybe they only dry out in drought years, depending on the weather. It can be super dependent on both the regional climatic differences as well as the varying characteristics of your specific depression or the vernal pool and the watershed that it's found in. But it is important to remember that it needs to be at least 2-month minimum of a wet period. And so these vernal pools are going to fill with water from rainfall, from surface runoff, maybe that intermittent stream flow, groundwater, and also overland flooding from nearby water bodies. And then, of course, over time, they are going to dry out with increased temperature and evapotranspiration through the vegetation that surrounds it. So this next slide is a great graph that shows that change over time. So precipitation may begin filling the pool in fall or early winter. Additionally, the loss of leaves from trees in the fall decreases the amount of water that is lost from the pool through evapotranspiration. And you can see we are right in the beginning of March. So you'll see it's kind of almost when it's at its deepest because pools reach that maximum depth in early to mid-spring through the combination of spring rain, snow melt, and groundwater inputs. We all know it snowed a decent amount this winter, and it consistently snowed. I was out in the field about a week ago, and really the snow melt was just doing that, right? You could still see snow around the edges of a lot of areas. And I'm sure we all have noticed how wet the ground is recently. So this is definitely a great year to get out there to look for these vernal pools, and they're going to be at their maximum depth throughout the month of March and into April. And so then pools will begin to decrease in size and depth in late spring through early fall due to both the increased temperatures, that decreased precipitation that might happen in the summer, and the increased evapotranspiration from the surrounding vegetation that's in full bloom, lots of greenery, all that kind of stuff. They may eventually dry out completely during these hot summer months, but like I said earlier, it can really depend on the climate, the region you're in. Climate change, right, is causing a lot more increased rainfall in certain areas of the country. So there are different factors that go into it, but at hot summertime is really when you might see them dry out. So going back to our vernal pool characteristics, they have really distinctive biological communities. So the most important thing to remember is that there is no permanent fish population. This is great because it supports animals that breed without the fish that might have those vulnerable eggs, the vulnerable larvae that really need that safe space that doesn't have that fish predator that will take them down. So there's specific types of amphibians and invertebrates, and we'll talk a little bit about the handful of those that are specific to our area a bit later on in the training. But it's important to keep in mind that these vernal pools are so valuable because they are protective of really unique and sometimes rare species that we may not know a lot about because they're not super common. So it's really good to know that. Some other things about the distinctive biological communities is that the animals are adapted to the vernal pool drying. So remember, keeping in mind, most likely it's going to dry out eventually, which means the animals that take advantage of the vernal pool or that live there either can leave upon drying, right? So once the eggs hatch and the larvae grow up into an adult form, they can eventually leave. Or maybe they have eggs that are resistant to the drying effect. So there is actually a species of fairy shrimp that the eggs are resistant to that drying, which is pretty cool. And then finally, it does have, vegetation and plants both within and surrounding the vernal pool that are our typical wetland species. So they're going to be tolerant of saturated soils, right? So in this area, we have some trees like the swamp white oak that's really used to wet soil. So you probably will most likely see that type of vegetation. And then finally, just something I already mentioned, but just to reemphasize, in this area, you're going to find them in the woodland context. You can also find them in other areas that might be more of an open canopy type vernal pool. And you might actually find a lot of those along the eastern shore where, even though we're still in Maryland, it's a very different type of environment. But here in Howard and Baltimore County, it will generally be more in a woodland context. Most of you, I'm assuming, are from this area, so it shouldn't be a surprise. And then let's keep going on. Why are vernal pools important? So we might already know some of this, but really, if you're not familiar with vernal pools, they do provide so many wonderful benefits to both the species there as well as people, us. So it provides ecological services for both. The ecological services for the species are obviously, like I said earlier, important breeding habitat for these amphibians. So vernal pools are required for breeding for certain amphibians and invertebrates. And just think about, if we don't have the vernal pools, these species won't survive, right? So they really need that protected environment without the fish to reproduce and maintain their population. The vernal pools are also going to support both aquatic and terrestrial food webs. And that's kind of just something where there's the intersection where animals need the pool and others might utilize it from time to time, both for habitat or maybe to connect the food webs between the rest of the forest. But there is some information, some data coming out that there's certain species of birds that utilize vernal pools within their food web, which is kind of interesting. And then, of course, they do provide stepping stones within the landscape. They can really bring in that extra valuable habitat and species into an area that may be otherwise looking the same or feeling homogenous or whatnot. So if you're walking through the forest, you may be looking around and thinking it's a forest, right? It all kind of looks the same, trees on trees on trees. But it's pretty great that a vernal pool can provide that unique habitat within a otherwise homogenous looking environment. And then when it comes to ecological services for people, there's also plenty on that side as well. Pollution removal, which is a big one. They kind of act like kidneys for the landscape. So the wet soil that you'll find in a vernal pool can really do a good job of capturing and cleansing the nitrogen pollution that can come from our lawns, our golf courses, maybe our cleaning supplies if we're out washing our cars. So yes, of course, we want to do everything in our power to reduce our nitrogen input from the start. But it is a great thing to know that vernal pools do a great job of helping us reduce the amount of nitrogen that enters our environment as well. They also help with groundwater replenishment. So they capture and retain that snow melt and the rainwater, and it allows it to infiltrate into the soil and can help replenish groundwater resources. I love this next one because it's kind of counterintuitive until you think about it a little bit more, but it is a natural mosquito control. So while, initially they may provide some water for mosquitoes to breed, the amphibians and the other insects that populate the pools can consume any remaining mosquitoes. So a really cool fun fact is that a single dragonfly nymph can consume up to like 133 larvae in a 24-hour period. So in comparison to the small pools of water, small bodies of water we might find in our backyards, like in flower pots or broken pipes, or maybe our kids' yard toys, you're more likely going to have breeding and large populations of mosquitoes from that much smaller pools of water than you would from a vernal pool. And then finally, connection to nature. This goes for a lot of things that we find in our natural environment, but especially for vernal pools. It can really connect humans to the biodiversity in their backyard or nearby areas, which can provide really unique and exciting opportunities to see those amphibians and those invertebrates that we may not see normally when we're out and about in the Patapsco area. Especially when it comes to the rare species that may be endangered or on those watch lists. Connecting humans to those species is the first step in getting people to care and want to protect them. So if you think about like more iconic species, or otherwise known as the charismatic megafauna, so the polar bear, the lion, the bald eagle, the panda, most people know about those animals and we care about them and we raise money to protect them. But just keep in mind that the little guys need the attention too. And so vernal pools are a great spot to connect with nature, to connect with species you may not normally see. All right. These are just some of the photos I wanted to include to show you the types of things you might see at a vernal pool, some of those unique critters. So the photo on the upper left is an example of that dragonfly nymph eating a mosquito larvae. The upper right is a spotted salamander, and they're just so cool looking. The little polka dot guys, very unique. And the bottom left is the wood frog, very, very common in our area. You'll probably hear them before you see them. And I did put in a frog call and a few slides down, so we'll try and listen to that in a few minutes. And then the bottom right is the wood frog's egg mass. And so I'm really hoping you guys will see eggs when you go out into the field, because it's exciting to find and definitely something to keep your eyes peeled for during the month of March. So yeah, these are just some of the wonderful things you would see at a vernal pool to get people excited about them. All right, so you are here because you want to help us. which is wonderful. And so you're probably asking, what can I do as an individual? And so you can help us find and inventory them. Like I said at the beginning, we're a small organization. We can't be everywhere at once. So getting as many boots on the ground, eyes in the watershed as possible is super helpful to finding these vernal pools and submitting it on our data forms so that we know where they are. And like I said, the first step to protecting vernal pools from possibly development or other types of degradation is really knowing where they are. And the more we know and the more we understand about them, the more likely we are to get people to care. It's just human nature. All right, so the inventory, what are we talking about with this inventory? Like I said, it's a pilot year. For now, we are just holding it during the month of March. But if you're thinking back to that chart where I showed you the pools last through maybe April, May, dry out in the summer, it's totally great if you want to keep looking for them in April and May. We're really just trying to corral people to look during the month of March, to get excited about vernal pools. So if you're loving it and you want to keep looking later on, that's great. But for now, we're going to keep reminding people to look throughout the month of March. And we like to just say we're getting dots on a map. For future years, there will be more intensive, more well-rounded data we want to collect about the pools. But for now, we just want to get dots on a map. And of course, in future years, we would also like to visit these pools during different times of the year to determine their duration, their wet duration, and when they dry out, and possibly any changes. But for now, we're just trying to get a baseline of understanding where they are and what they look like. So I put down these 4 steps for the inventory, and it's pretty intuitive. It's nothing too complicated right now. You're going to go out on your own time and walk the watershed. So I'm not necessarily assigning you a date to go out or a week to go out. This is more when you have the time to go out on your own time and look for them. Please do just keep your head on a swivel, keep your eyes peeled for them, look for the vernal pools. There is a Google form that I created for data collection that I'll show you in a second. And there is required data, and it's pretty simple. You'll see when I show you the Google form. And then there's some optional data. The optional data is, if you have the time or if you have the ability to collect a little bit more stuff, we'd be happy to have it. It's not required, right? But if you have the time, we would really appreciate it. The best part is that this Google form can be opened right on your smartphone. So if you have access to your smartphone, if you have service in the field and you just want to submit it right then and there while you're at the vernal pool, that's wonderful. Of course, you can also just access it from your laptop or your computer at home. So you can feel free to just take maybe some notes in the field with you, and then when you get home, you can submit it then. So this image on the right is actually a video. I took a screen recording of my phone opening the Google form so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Let's see if it'll play for me. Okay, so here we go. Pretty basic. This is some of the required data, what you would expect, your name, your email, the date you go out. We are interested in the weather. So is it cold? Is it warm? Has it rained recently? That'll give us a good idea of maybe why it's the depth of the water it's at. Of course, the most important thing here is obviously the location, right? That is going to be required data for this pilot year. You can either copy and paste a Google pin from Google Maps, or if you're not into Google Maps, you don't want to deal with that. You can always pull up the GPS coordinates on your smartphone's compass, or maybe you have a real compass, which is pretty cool. But either way, we need a Google pin or the GPS coordinates so that we can then put it on our map. And if possible, so it's not required, but if you can, we would love to have some photos of the vernal pool. So both of the vernal pool itself and then maybe a little bit backed up so we can see the surrounding vegetation. That'd be really great. You can upload the files directly to this Google form, but if you'd prefer, maybe the file's too big, if you'd prefer to just email it to me, that's great too. And then moving on, this is the optional data. So like I said, please don't worry about doing it if you don't have the time or ability, but if you feel comfortable, it'd be great. And it's the type of data we want to collect down the road. So getting a head start is wonderful. So area size, if possible, carefully walk around the pool and report the number of steps it took for you to get around it. So nothing too scientific right now, right? It's just a bit of an estimate. And then the depth, you can either estimate it just by looking at it, or maybe using a stick or a yardstick if you bring one. The land use type. So generally, the Patapsco watershed is relatively in a developed urban area, right? Of course, once you get a little bit farther west out into Carroll County and whatnot, it's a little bit less developed. But try to be as specific as possible. So maybe you're on a hike and you find a vernal pool, but where you're hiking, you can see a gas station through the trees, or you can see a Walmart through the trees. Let us know that. Like, if you can see things just by looking around that aren't the trees or the forest that you're walking in, that's a good thing to note. Canopy cover, just look up, just give us a rough estimate of the percentage of the sky that has tree canopy. The vegetation you might find in and around the pool. So what temps are you seeing? Definitely don't need you to go down to the species level. Just if you see some trees, shrubs, grasses, pretty general terms, nothing too crazy. And then finally, the animals. Any species or types of animals you see in the pool. Are you seeing frogs? Are you hearing frogs? The salamanders, the turtles. And please definitely include any eggs or larvae that you might see. And like I said, it's totally okay if you can't identify what it is. That's why it's great to submit some photos to me as well. But worst case scenario, if you can just get us the Google pin, our staff can go out on our own time during the work week and kind of figure out what might be there and identify it for us. All right. So moving on. All right, what to look for. So we already went over all the characteristics of a vernal pool, and some of it, is going to be easy to remember. Some of it may not be, but these are the few things that, especially in this area, are going to be helpful for you to look for when you're out in the field. So of course, first things first, you just want to find that isolated pool of water. And it's most commonly going to be found in depressions and otherwise flat areas. So this area, the Patapsco watershed, is relatively flat already. So you're going to have a good chance of finding vernal pools no matter where you're hiking. So it's not like you're out, in the western counties in Frederick and Garrett where it's tons of mountainous hiking. It might be a different story out there. But here in the valley, it is already relatively flat. So it's already a good spot to be looking. I do want to mention pit and mound topography. So this photo on the right kind of shows you initially in a forest when trees fall over, whether it's from old age, wind, weather, etc. You're going to have that mound of where the tree pulls up its root system, and then you're going to have a pit. So the photo shows you when it's immediately happened, right? And I'm not necessarily saying you're only going to find vernal pools in those pits, but over time, while the forest is growing old and regenerating, there might be those little pit and mounds from fallen trees over time that have grown and they've developed new little topography to the land. So it's pretty intuitive, right? Like, to collect the rainwater, to collect the snow melt, you need to have those little pockets in the ground, but just something to keep in mind. The more exciting part when it comes to looking for vernal pools is looking for indicator or obligate species. So the indicator or obligate species are those that are dependent on vernal pools for breeding. They're really important. They need it to reproduce. And in our area, there's 3 that you're most likely going to find. That is the wood frog, the marbled salamander, the spotted salamander, or their egg masses, right? Especially this time of year, you might find some of those egg masses. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail on all 3 of those in a second. But like I mentioned earlier, even if you are not 100% sure that you found a vernal pool, please still record it and submit it to the inventory, and our staff can get out to take a look. We have more of that time to visit a couple times and maybe see if some eggs develop at some point, or that we know that it's isolated from a permanent water source. Okay, so we're going to go through the 3 obligate species that you're most likely going to find in the Patapsco watershed. So the first one is the wood frog. It is the most common out of all three of those. And it's what is known as an early caller. So you might already be hearing them, or you might hear them somewhat soon. But they are, they are pretty common, especially in this area. I included two photos of the wood frog here because sometimes they're a little bit more brown, like you see on the left photo, and sometimes they might be a little bit more red, like you see in the right. But it can be either color. Just notice that they both have those ridges going down from the eyes to the hind legs. It's a really good thing to look for as well. And then the photo on the right is that egg mass. And the wood frog really lays a lot of eggs all at once. So you're going to find these masses that have anywhere from maybe 500 to 1,000 eggs per mass. Something to note, which will be important to compare to the next couple of species, is that the wood frog egg mass does not have an outer jelly matrix. If you look closely in that photo, you can kind of see the individual shape of each circular egg. I know it's kind of hard to notice now, and we can kind of go back and forth between the next two slides, but it is important to note there is no outer jelly matrix. I'm going to play the frog call, and let's hope you all can hear it. So I hope you heard it. If you didn't, I can definitely send you an audio file in the follow-up email. That's what frog sounds like. Moving on to our next species. Let's see. I see there's something in the chat. Okay, you can hear it. Let's see. Okay, spotted salamander. So this is another one that you might find in our area. The spotted salamander is part of the mole salamander family, meaning just like a mole, they spend most of their time underground. So a lot of people maybe haven't seen them yet because they are underground a lot of the time, but they do come above ground to breed in the late winter and early spring. And they're just so cool looking, right? The polka dots, I just love them. But the eggs, which you'll see on the right, they'll lay anywhere from like maybe 75 to 100 eggs. They can be clear or that opaque white color. But something to note between the spotted salamander and the wood frog is that this one has that outer protective film to the egg mass. So you can kind of see the individual eggs inside, and the individual eggs inside might look similar to the wood frog, but it definitely does have that outer protective film to the entire egg mass, which is important to keep in mind. And you can probably tell from the photo, but a lot of these egg masses are going to be attached to maybe some of the vegetation that's building up in the vernal pool, whether that's the grasses, the fallen leaves and whatnot. So it needs something to cling to, the substrate. So you most often find them there. And then my slide would go. There we go. The last one we want to look for is the marbled salamander. Like the spotted salamander, this is another mole salamander, so the type that is underground a lot. They are less common than the spotted, especially in this area. You're not going to see them as often as you might find a spotted salamander. And something that's a little bit different for these guys is that they lay their eggs in the fall. So even though the pools may be dried up by then, they lay their eggs in that leftover depression that we find in the ground that will eventually fill with water and become the vernal pool. So these guys do kind of get a head start on growing a little bit earlier. And of course, if we have enough rain and it rains in the fall and winter, they might already hatch then, but if not, they can, overwinter and then kind of grow in the spring. So looking at the photo on the right, they might lay anywhere from like 30 to 100 eggs, and there is no outer jelly matrix or anything like that, like from the previous salamander. They're just kind of clustered together, and most often they're going to look brown or black because they're in the dirt. Okay, where to look? So this is something I wanted to kind of touch on because I want to provide some guidance on where to look, and I want you all to be successful in finding vernal pools because if you find one, it's exciting, success breeds success kind of thing. So the first thing I want to note is that in general, everywhere and anywhere, right? Especially in the Patapsco watershed and it being in a valley in an area that's doesn't have a lot of elevation change, we're going to find vernal pools all over. So keep your eyes peeled when maybe you're on your hikes in the state park, in your local parks, on your neighborhood walks, exploring your backyard. You might have a backyard that's large, or maybe it backs up to some public land. So doing your best to always having your head on a swivel is really important. Let's see, but you can go to specific areas to increase your chances of finding a pool. So just re-emphasizing again, flat areas of the watershed. Rainfall and snowmelt is going to travel to the lowest elevation where it will collect. And so, you know, I think of elevation changes, I think of like the Union Dam Trail. You're most likely not going to find a vernal pool on that strenuous switchback trail that gets your heart rate pumping by the time you're done. But you might find vernal pools once you hit the bottom and you're at the lower levels along the edges of the river. So just to keep in mind, anything that's, you know, changes in elevation is going to lower your chances of finding a vernal pool. But what I did want to bring in is the Maryland Amphibian and Reptile Atlas, otherwise known as MARA, or the HERP Atlas is what the nickname is for it. It was a 5-year survey to systematically document amphibian and reptile distributions throughout the state. It provides a great baseline for future surveying and changes. And so what I did, let's move to the next slide. I took a map of our watershed and I overlaid it with what is called the HERP Atlas quad blocks. And so basically the group took this and it split the watershed up into roughly 10 square mile blocks. And then, you know, if there were certain species that were spotted within each of these squares here, I could cross-reference it with the HERP Atlas to see what is found. And so I already did that cross-reference for you. There we go. So these green squares, there's a lot of them, but the green squares are areas that have confirmed both spotted salamander and wood frog sightings. So we know for certain at some point that species was found within these green squares. And really, to no surprise, the bulk of those green squares follow along Patapsco Valley State Park, which makes a lot of sense considering those areas are the most protected in our area in general. So it's going to be some conserved and preserved natural spaces where the vernal pools can be there. And then I also overlaid these red squares. These red squares only had wood frog sightings. Now keep in mind, take that with a grain of salt, wood frogs are still the obligate, the indicator species. They require the vernal pools, so I'm definitely not saying you wouldn't find vernal pools in these red squares. You just might have a higher chance of finding them in the green squares, since those are the spots where both the spotted salamander and the wood frog has been found. And then one last exciting thing is this yellow star. So that green square with the yellow star inside of it is where all 3 of those obligate species were found. So it has confirmed spottings of the spotted salamander, the wood frog, and the marbled salamander. That was the only quad block that had all 3, which is pretty exciting. So that is the McKeldin area is the bulk of that square. So you might have a higher chance of even looking in that area. But like I said, this is really just more about finding them in general. So if you are itching to get out there and you want to go to a spot where you have a high chance of finding a vernal pool, definitely follow along in any of these green squares. If maybe you live in a red square and you just want to look around where you live, that's totally fine as well, because it doesn't mean you wouldn't find it there. Okay. So this part is things to keep in mind when it comes to safety for yourself, as well as for the vernal pools. So like I said, safety first. Use the buddy system or tell someone where you will be. That's always super important about going into the field. I love to solo hike. I do it all the time, but I always make sure to either text someone and let them know when I think I'll be done. And if they haven't heard from me in a certain amount of time, then they can find out where I am, that kind of stuff. We are unfortunately still in a pandemic, so please mask up or at least bring a mask with you, and be sure to social distance. And as always, wear sunscreen, bring water, and always check for ticks. I know it's not super warm yet, but this area, as a lot of us know, has lots of ticks, and the first few warm days, they're probably going to come back with a vengeance. So definitely always check that. The next part is all about preventing disease transmission when it comes to looking for and maybe hiking around vernal pools. So the spread of certain pathogens is a major threat to amphibians and reptiles worldwide. And unfortunately, humans can transmit diseases from one place to another and from one organism to another in a really short amount of time and over distances that the organisms themselves cannot traverse. So we are pretty efficient disease vectors. And so that really just means being super careful when it comes to observing and being near vernal pools. So do everything in your power to avoid entering a vernal pool. If you accidentally do, or for some reason you have to cross one, please be mindful of that damp mud caked on your boots. That is the perfect way for us to transmit diseases. So if you do have that caked on mud on your boots or your shoes, if you have that, please follow up with a disinfection protocol to clean your boots before moving to a new area. And this short little video, I think it's like 5 minutes long, goes over that disinfection process. So I'm going to show it real quick, but I'll also send some follow-up information in an email after with that so that you can be ready to go. Oh no.
No one forgets their first encounter with a frog, salamander, turtle, or the sound of a frog chorus heralding the first days of spring. These events mark places and seasons in our minds, connecting us to nature and revealing how we fit into the larger world. They can be life-changing. Sadly, many of these animals are disappearing, and a major threat to their survival is infectious diseases. Ranavirus is one of the leading causes of amphibian population declines around the world. Turtles, snakes, and fish are also susceptible to ranavirus. Once infected, animals can experience severe internal bleeding and rapid death. In fact, scientific evidence shows that populations of species sensitive to these viral infections could go extinct within just a few years. How does ranavirus spread to amphibians and reptiles? People can unknowingly carry the virus, which can attach to skin, boots, clothes, equipment, vehicles, and recreational gear, from a wetland with the disease to another without it. Once introduced, the virus can spread quickly. Frogs, toads, and salamanders with ranavirus can develop skin lesions, blood spots, and swollen abdomens. Infected turtles will often have a runny nose, swollen neck, and white plaques inside the mouth. Diseased animals may act lethargic, move erratically, or fail to react when threatened. However, not all animals carrying ranavirus will display symptoms. You can help slow the spread of ranavirus by using these simple steps before and after you enter a wetland. To begin, set up your cleaning station at least 100 feet away from any wetland or body of water to avoid contamination from bleach. Brush the dirt off your boots and gear. and rinse with clean water. Soak or spray them with a 10% bleach solution, or 1 cup of household bleach in 1 gallon of water. Let this soak for 5 minutes. To finish, rinse everything well with clean water. At a minimum, for larger equipment and gear, pressure wash and allow to air dry. To learn more about ranavirus or other emerging infectious diseases, or to report sick or dead animals, go to www.ranavirusdecon.org. Remember, brush, rinse, bleach, and rinse. By doing these simple measures, you will do your part to protect our amazing wildlife.
All right. So yeah, for the most part, you're not going to have a ton of equipment out there, right? It's just probably going to be your boots or your hiking shoes. But it's just really important to keep in mind we want to do our best to prevent that disease transmission while we're out and about. So that's pretty much it. You are officially ready to head out into the watershed and look for vernal pools. So while this is our pilot year and we're just finding as many pools as possible, the ultimate goal for the future is to turn this into a year-round project where we continue to visit the pools year-round to monitor for their duration and other changes over time. Please email me. I have my email right there, and you'll get a follow-up email from me as well. But please email me if you have any future questions that I don't answer at the end of this, or if you have interest in getting more guidance on where to look. So the follow-up email, which you'll get if you registered, which feel free to forward it to anyone else who maybe didn't join us today. It will have the link to this recording. It will have the link to the Google form where you will submit your data. I'll also include some of the links to the HERP Atlas and that map grid, as well as a few of the resources for preventing that disease transmission and the disinfection protocol if you end up needing to use it. But just something to keep in mind, we saw from the HERP Atlas squares a few slides ago, the most promising areas will follow along where Patapsco Valley State Park is, and that's no surprise since it's most protected there. But the blocks are still fairly large, and I realize that. I think, like I said, around 10 square miles each. So unfortunately, I can't get too specific on where to show you to go, but it will point you in a general direction, which is at least a start. I do want to, if you want to stick around for a second, I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint and show you the HERP Atlas website, just in case you want to mess around with it. So I already did the work for you to do the cross-referencing to show you the green squares, but it's a really cool tool to use. So if you just want to kind of check it out, I highly recommend it. So let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, I'm going to share again. Bear with me here. All right. So you should be able to see the database. I'm hoping you can see it. If not, let me know. But it's pretty exciting because this tool right here would let you look at each individual quad block or those squares I showed you about from the grid system. Now, I hope you can see this. It is the map. It's called Merlin, Maryland Environmental Resource and Land Information Network. So It's going to look a bit overwhelming at first because there's a ton of different boxes you can check to get different information. But what I use is the living resources once you go in there and you click the Maryland Amphibian and Reptile Atlas grid. So that literally gives you this grid system right here. You click on a square and it will literally tell you what the name is. So it's Relay-Northwest. And then you'd go back over here. You'd go to the quad block you're interested in. There's a lot of them. Where are we? Relay, relay, relay. And you get your stats. And then you get the full rundown of all the amphibians and reptiles that have been spotted there. And like I said, we're looking for those obligate species. So we're looking for the spotted salamander, which has been seen there. We're looking for the wood frog, which has been seen there. So it's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool tool to use. And I'll definitely send you the links so you can access that if you're interested. But other than that, that's pretty much it for our training. You'll definitely get an email from me in the next day or two with all the follow-up information. I can check our chat real quick, see if there are any specific questions. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you for attending. Justine, so if you find a drainage ditch with calling wood frogs, do you want to know about it? You know, the easy answer is yes. Like I said, it's always good to know where we're finding these types of species. So I would love to know. I mean, maybe you can make a note in your data submission that it's more of a drainage ditch because, you know, stormwater management ponds and drainage ditches aren't necessarily vernal pools. Probably either, you know, if they're a dry ditch, they're not going to be wet long enough. Or if they're a wet ditch, they're going to be wet all the time. There is going to be no drying, and so it might allow access to some of those predators. So they don't exactly fit the narrative of a vernal pool, but if they're providing habitat for the wood frogs, that is something important to know. So I say there's no harm in at least submitting it and just making a note of it, right, and letting us know, and we can kind of go out over a couple times just to see what you're talking about. I'm not seeing any other questions, I don't think. But like I said, please don't hesitate to email me with any follow-up questions. Happy to answer them. So thank you so much. I appreciate your time and hope you all enjoy looking for vernal pools. I'll be going out on my own as well, so you might be getting follow-up emails with photos and videos of pools I find. So stay tuned. Thank you. Oh, sorry, Joanne, I'm seeing your question now. If we know vernal pools outside of the grid areas, are those okay to survey? So yes, of course, we are specifically looking for vernal pools in the Patapsco watershed. And so I focus specifically on, you know, the watershed itself. Some of those quad blocks actually have pieces that are within the Patapsco watershed and pieces that are in the Patuxent. I would say there's no harm in letting us know. Of course, you know, vernal pools are super valuable resources. So if you send us a Google pin of a vernal pool in the Patuxent watershed, we'll absolutely still stick it on our map. We are prioritizing the Patapsco watershed, but we have plenty of partners who are doing great work in the Patuxent, doing great work in the Gwynn Falls. So if you happen to live or work in one of those areas and you're just using this training to get better at identification and you want to still let us know, that's totally fine. But like I said, we are a Patapsco watershed group, so we are going to focus on that area.